Okay, I'm Thomas Hazlett, Director of the Information Economy Project, and welcome to our Tullock lecture today. We're delighted to have the outstanding Professor Bronwyn Howell from down under visit us and enlighten us with some of her research conducted over the last many years on broadband networks, their growth, development, and regulation. And before we get to that program, and I want to get right to it, because as you'll see, Ms. Howell speaks in a very funny accent and speaks very rapidly, but has much to say, and we want to do all the time for that. I just want to alert the audience for a couple of upcoming programs. Thomas Kratenmacher, prominent law professor, known to many of you for his work in law and economics over the years, but also an expert on broadcast regulation, and he will be speaking here at George Mason University, Arlington, Wednesday, October 17th, talking about indecency law in broadcasting, particularly as relates to the current proceeding in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, FCC versus Fox. And for those of you who know Tom Kratenmacher, he's really the top of the food chain when it comes to broadcasting law and policy, and in general law and economics as relates to network development. And he's been doing a lot of great work from antitrust to regulatory policy for 4 decades now. We're also delighted to have something quite interesting, if different, and that is a real entrepreneur, Jeff Sandifer, who is the founding dean of something called the Acton School of Business. If you don't know about the Acton MBA, you might want to check this out. It's really quite a fascinating experiment in higher education. It's zoomed to the top, indeed the elite MBA programs in America, competing with Harvard, Stanford, and so forth. In a very small number of years, Sandifer is a real former entrepreneur who's now an entrepreneur in the education sector and has now gone into primary education. And the question that's beguiling so many policymakers in so many countries is how to actually get new technologies into the classroom that improve educational outcomes. It seems that it's fairly easy to spend money on technology and fairly difficult to actually use the technology productively. And this is something that Sandifer is tackling in very innovative ways. And so he's going to give a talk about his work and a proposal he has for reforming education in America. That talk Wednesday, November 14th. So, with that, we have the pleasure of having an outstanding economist, introducing an outstanding economist. And those of you who know Scott Wallsten know that he's really one of the preeminent experts in broadband policy, broadband regulation. He's a product of Stanford University. That's the university that just walloped the University of Southern California in football. Being from UCLA, I have a football team that can never beat USC, but I heartily applaud all of those universities that do. So I thank Scott for that contribution. Anyway, Scott is at the the Technology Policy Institute, but he was also chief economist of the National Broadband Plan Task Force at the FCC, and has a wide range of experience. And he's going to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tom. I think Bronwyn actually needs no introduction, but we're going to have everybody introduce everybody else before we get to the speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bronwyn Howell today. And as you know from the flyers that you've seen around, and for those of you who are at TPRC, the ad shown 24/7 on the monitors around the law school, that she hails from New Zealand, the New Zealand Institute for the Study of Regulation and Competition, and is going to talk today about evidence-based broadband regulation. She's been bringing evidence, much of it uncomfortable for policymakers, for some time now, on broadband policy and other issues too. And she's a unique researcher, that she comes to her academic work with a background in actual business, and she also has an MBA and a degree in operations research, which is important for informing her work. And in my opinion, her research is of the best sort, that it questioning and usually destroying conventional wisdom, and making people quite uncomfortable, as I said, and it's great. Now, very early, even more than a decade ago, I was reading a 2006 paper of hers earlier today, and Bronwyn pointed out this actually goes back even further to 2000, that she noted that certain regulations were suppressing broadband demand, and that in fact broadband adoption was much more of a demand issue than a supply issue, and yet policies and policymakers always wanted to focus on the supply side of the equation. Also, in an incredibly comprehensive history of regulation in New Zealand, she noted that New Zealand was doing pretty well in this area until the country started imposing increasingly strict unbundling regulations. And that at the time there was a very heavy focus on perceived misdeeds by the incumbent who had been recently privatized rather than potential effects of regulation. And it was either for that or for a different 2006 paper, I wasn't quite sure which, that Internet New Zealand had to hire 2 consultants to try to debunk this work, which is always the sign that somebody's doing something really good when an interest group has to try to say that it's not. Now, in her paper at TPRC on the New Zealand Fibre Project, she discussed how politics has trumped economics in the country's decision to embark on that project. Again, pointing out that they're ignoring important characteristics of demand. Now, on a slightly different topic, still on broadband, I think one of her most interesting papers is that I think is, I don't know if underappreciated is the right word, but I think not talked about enough. It's a paper in 2010 called The Tyranny of Distance. Well, people all over the place are promoting the virtues of cloud computing and how it's going to be great for developing countries and so on. Bronwyn pointed out that when you're really, really far away from everything else and you have very small populations that can't support caching, cloud computing is not good for you. The speed of light actually matters. Latency begins to build up, and you end up in a really bad situation where everything, all the content you need is thousands and thousands of miles away. It makes real-time interaction almost impossible. I don't think that's what the talk is about today, but I think it's a really interesting point, and still ignored by people who think cloud computing is the cure for all that else. So today's talk is on regulating broadband networks, the global data for evidence-based public policy. Whenever I hear the phrase evidence-based policy, I think of something that Mary has told me that he heard, for instance, from Martin Cave, which is that, well, everyone says that regulators say they want evidence-based policymaking. Instead, we tend to have policy-based evidence-making. So what I'm hoping we'll hear today is whether there's a chance for some actual evidence-based policymaking or whether we're stuck forever with policy-based evidence-making. So, Prof.
Where is escape?
That's not it.
Brent?
Is that
Oh, there it is. Desktop?
Hard to get technology used in the classroom.
This isn't the acting school.
Despite the fact that
We could just get another $3 million grant from the E-rate program. We have this figured out.
and despite the fact that Microsoft has standardized the software all over the world, no 2 universities have managed to get everything look the same. Well, look, thank you very much, Scott, for that introduction. I'd like to especially acknowledge also the Information Economy Project and Thomas Hazlitt for the invitation to come today to present this work. And also my academic colleagues who are very numerous and probably will want to remain anonymous because they wouldn't want to be associated with some of the things I've said sometimes, for their inspiration and constructive criticism. And I count Scott particularly amongst those because we have had a number of dialogues over the years about these issues. But if it wasn't for the industry, the decision makers and the policy makers in it, we wouldn't actually have anything to analyse. So I really do owe a great deal of gratitude to them for the wonderful laboratory they've given me to work on. I'd like to just start this talk with a little bit of context that has been quite helpful in framing what the way I've organised what I'm presenting to you today. New Zealand is a long way from the United States. New Zealand is the world's smallest, most distant economy, a developed economy. It's the most isolated by virtually every indicator that has been produced. It has a population of 4.1 million people. It is 220 milliseconds away from anything that matters, which is the return trip time on something to move from Auckland to San Francisco. And one might wonder what an economist most of whose work has been driven in its inspiration initially because of regulatory choices made in the New Zealand environment, could possibly have to say to a policy and academic audience and industry audience in the capital city of the country where the internet was developed, and which still continues even now to be the lead country in the development of applications, both economic and social, for the technology. I think, though, that New Zealand's path in the last 30 years has been very interesting. We started in the 1980s as a world leader in policy matters in relation to telecommunications. We were the first country in the OECD to have a fully privatised incumbent operator outside of the United States. We were also the first and only country so far to have endeavoured to have an industry governance arrangement governed entirely by competition law without an industry-specific regulator. We have been, at the same time, also looking at the same time as we deregulated and privatised our telecommunications provider, we also embarked on an industry-wide set of economic reforms that were governed principally by how a small country the size of New Zealand can manage to get an efficient outcome despite its size and despite its distance. There's been a lot of interesting learnings that have come from that, and one of the most important, I think, has been increasingly the fact that when a country is a leader, it creates a lot of research. When New Zealand went down its path in the early 1980s, it generated a lot of interest because we were first. Generally, as we've said, policy-led research comes in the initial stages because when you are the leader, there is no evidence to find. So there's no point in looking for it. You can only be motivated by theory. What we did in New Zealand invoked a lot of international interest in coming to look at what was happening as we moved in our deregulated world towards particularly in the communications sector, looking at what happens when you govern only by competition law without an industry-specific regulator. We had a lot of interest from academics from the United States in particular who came over to New Zealand in large part because the economics that was governing the transformation came largely from the Chicago School, and the telecommunications companies that moved into the privatised world in New Zealand were also largely based in the United States. So it did generate a lot of research in what was going on. And what it's led me to believe that when you do lead, you do need to also monitor what happens when you're playing out those policies. And in that period, we did see a lot of research activity on what was happening in New Zealand. New Zealand, though, had a little bit of reform shock after the 1980s and 1990s. As I said, the reforms were economy-wide, they were far-reaching, and they created a lot of people who were hurt in one way or another. And because they covered the entire economy, there was virtually no one left who wasn't harmed in at least one respect from those changes. And it led to New Zealand undergoing a period of, it has been described as stopping to take a cup of tea. But the net result is that there was a political swing in New Zealand away from the reforms of the 80s and 90s, where we were world leading, to wanting to become a follower. Now, having thought through that, I would have thought that in the New Zealand context, having moved from being a leader to a follower, that should have actually opened up the opportunities for even more research to be done, where New Zealand researchers could have then been motivated to go and look at what was happening in other countries, to examine their evidence base on what they'd done with their regulations to see how it might come back and inform New Zealand. Yet, strangely, what's happened is I've been left as as a researcher with market power, because I seem to be rather alone as the only person in my part of the world who is researching these things. And it's led me to think about whether there's something about the process of competition law that actually leads to the generation of more research. And thinking through the issues, I've come to the conclusion that there is something there about a contestable set of processes and the presence of an arbitrator who has certain expertise and some understanding about how you might interpret and weigh this evidence, and also the motivations for people both for and against a proposition that a regulation might have some effect to actually be motivated to do the research in the first place. So as a theme or a motif for this lecture today, I'm wanting to think about what the legal processes of evidence and a contestable court-based process might lead us to think about when we're looking at an evidence-based policy process, and how we might learn from that in developing better policy. Because, as I've seen in New Zealand, the further we've moved away from the bleeding edge of regulatory policy, the less and less research has been done, the less and less contestability there's been to it, and the less and less we've seen these matters being arbitrated by experts, i.e. economists and lawyers within the competition authority, and the more and more that this has come to be something that's the domain of politicians, where the court of public opinion makes the decisions on what happens. So I'm going to explore some ideas around that. So there's a little bit of normative theory in what I'm going to talk about today, as well as all of my war stories, which Tom assures me you will want to hear about. But we'll see where the thought takes us to a place where I think there are some very significant differences ultimately in the way these matters are now approached in the United States relative to New Zealand. And unfortunately, I think my country is coming second in that race. So what I'm going to do is just start off by working out and getting some agreement on what we actually think a principal policy making process should contain in its steps. I'm then going to look at what that means for evidence-based policy making, and I'll put up some propositions of what I think that might contain, and then I'll apply it to many different aspects of broadband regulation generally, and then some specific examples of what I've seen going on, particularly in New Zealand and the United States, but with the odd other OECD exemplar as it appears appropriate. So, most policy-making processes agree that these are the steps that a good policy-making process should have. First, to define the object of interest. Second, identify how to measure it. And then the difficulties start. Because the object of interest is almost always intangible, there's never a single metric that tells you all you need to know. You need multiple metrics to be able to assess these things. But the metrics themselves are all only proxies. And as any economist will know, your proxy is only as good as its closeness to that object. And the further away it is, the less likely or less beneficial it's going to be by incentivising the proxy rather than the thing you're really trying to achieve. So we need to make sure that if there are multiple proxies, that we do have to know what they are, and we have to have some idea of how they're associated with each other. Broadly speaking, some sort of weighting process or prioritisation to see how they interact with each other. Having worked out those two things, we have to actually define whether there's actually a problem that needs addressing in the first place. Now that means working out whose problem it might be. Is it policymakers? Is it specific communities of interest? And what objective are they trying to pursue? Is it increased broadband uptake? Is it a more competitive market? Is it closing digital divides? Or is it something else completely different, as I've contended in New Zealand, that our policy objective in broadband regulation now is actually following the OECD policy orthodoxy of what everyone else has done, no matter what the consequences are. So we do have to be clear, what objective are we trying to achieve here? And it's only then, after we've sorted out those things, that it's possible to now identify whether we even have a problem, let alone to start developing some alternative policy interventions that might address it. Now, it's very much a characteristic in New Zealand, and there's a comment there about policy-led research. In many other countries, they also face the problem that everyone just jumps in at step 4 of the process and works on from there, and perhaps begins and ends at 4, identifying the alternative, singular not plural, and implementing it. It is important, though, when one does assess these policy interventions, that they do get evaluated against some sort of counterfactuals. So the policy alternatives over the entire lifespan of the policy, not just a short period up to the next election, needs to be looked at. The policies need to be evaluated relative to each other, and they need to be evaluated relative to the status quo. And the important thing in policy making is the status quo is itself dynamic. If we're looking at this over the life of the policy, we can't just assume that the status quo is what we see today, fixed in time into the future. It moves too. So we have to take that into account. It's only after that evaluation that we can now decide upon a course of action, and acknowledging in this that no action is actually an action if there isn't actually any evidence to support in the evaluative phase that there is a benefit from moving from where you are today to where you might be with the policy. And the next two steps are the ones that implementing the chosen action then happens, and the next step, evaluate, evaluate, and evaluate again, is the one that I very rarely see anywhere, because you never know that what you've enacted in this complex dynamic world is going to achieve what you actually set out to. It needs to be evaluated against your original objective, and if in the case that your original objective might have changed over time, then you really have to go right back to the beginning and start again on a completely new policy exercise. It's not just a matter of tweaking the parameters of the policy you've already got as your objective changes. You've got to think about the other things that might have also changed in your view of the world as a consequence of that. And importantly, having done that, if you do find that in fact the best step is aborting the policy, you do have to be prepared to carry through on that. So in that context, what is evidence-based policy making? Well, that statement that I've taken at the top there comes from a classic text, that evidence is evidence, typically empirical, that the policy increases the likelihood of the desired objectives being delivered more efficiently than it is not implemented. The implied corollary of that is, whenever one intervenes, one should first do no harm. Or, for those of us who've been trained in classic economics and the Calder-Hicks criterion, if you are going to act, be at least sure that the net total of your benefits leaves you in a position to be able to compensate the losers, even if you don't actually do it. The motivations for evidence-based policy in the policy literature, though, as opposed to the economics literature, appears to derive its origins from the medical fraternity. So notably, it's come out of public health policies and draws on clinical trial processes. So ultimately, it does derive too from the scientific method, and that suggests that the evidence that needs to be viewed for these proposals needs to be drawn from objective criteria that come out of replicable and comparable experiments. So evidence is not simply doing a literature review to say he said, she said, and this is the outcome. It is actually going deeper into the data and trying to see what can come out of looking at it at a deeper level than that. It requires high levels of expertise, going back to the complexities of policy making. It requires creating, selecting and assembling a number of scenarios, what happens under the policy, under the policies, under the counterfactuals, and a lot of data associated with it. You need to determine the relevance of each of those scenarios, working out which is the most applicable, which is going to give you the best in the context that you're applying it in. You do have to think about attaching appropriate weightings to the data that you've got, and also about evaluating the alternatives. And as I said, this is going on in a highly complex, adaptive, systemic environment where there are manifest and inherent uncertainties. Basically, policymakers are working in a vacuum because policies are about affecting the future, and the future is uncertain. And I guess telecommunications has been a great teacher of us in this world, that you can never assume at a point in time that you know with certainty what the world is going to look like tomorrow or the day after. We need to have a system of evaluating these policies in this world where uncertainty is just a fact of life. It's not something that we add in as a sensitivity analysis. It's a core requirement in the context in which we're evaluating. So I think it's rather appropriate that I'm delivering this presentation today in law school because, as I said, law is a social science, and if we look at all the social sciences, which ones actually be best at dealing with this stuff? Well, that's precisely what law deals with anyway. The law has ways of dealing with weighting of evidence under uncertainty. It's got processes to determine whether the evidence is applicable. It's got contestable processes for arguing for and against the advantages or not of a particular state or claim being made. And it biases against irreversible actions occurring in the absence of sufficiently compelling evidence because you have to reach a certain standard of proof before you will find a party guilty. Also, the findings can also be nuanced by the quality of the evidence. You know, there is a distinction between beyond reasonable doubt or on the balance of probabilities, so that we can actually have some qualifications on how certain we are about the ability to deliver the evidence, the benefits. The decisions are also transparent and appealable, so that when mistakes are made, it's possible to be able to call to account the people who made those. And it brings in the role of some experts, or in the case of commissions like New Zealand's Telecommunications Commission or the FCC, some quasi-judicial experts who are qualified to understand the highly complex and technical matters that are being put before them. And in that sense, I think those whole set of processes are things that we saw in play during the competition law period in New Zealand, where most matters of substance were actually debated in the courts between parties who had the incentives to commission the research for and against propositions. It's something that I do continue to see largely in the processes I've seen in the FCC. It doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes are necessarily what other people might have wished to have had, but at least there are some processes to do so. That's not what we've seen in New Zealand in the last 6 or 7 years in particular, where most decisions of consequence have been moved out of the Commerce Commission and the Telecommunications Commission and have been moved into the political arena, where there is no appeal process. We have some of the most inexpert judges trying to make decisions on whether we should implement highly complex regulations like local refund bundling, and ultimately it comes down to political popularity on whether they're implemented or not. And that, I suggest, is a very bad place for policy to be made. So I want to now look at how this is applied, those principles apply to broadband policy. And this is where we can start getting into some of the literature that I have written. I've got a lot of material here. I may or may not get through all of it, and hopefully it'll get a flow of the story as we go. If I fail to get through it all, I have written a paper that does have most of the war stories and this theme through it. I'm sure that Tom and the people here at the project will be able to give you access to that. If we go back to the principles on what is evidence-based policy and how we might apply it to broadband, it throws up these 6 questions that I think are fundamental for the broadband policy making process. What is broadband? What is the broadband problem? What objective are we trying to achieve when we're addressing this problem? What evidence is there of whether we've actually got a problem in the first place, and how good or reliable is it? How applicable is it in particular contexts? What policies are out there that might ameliorate these problems? What evidence is there that supports the policies? And does observed policy making that we see in this context actually meet the good policy making expectations? Principally, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And having implemented them, have we seen evidence that policymakers are prepared to abandon ineffective policies when the evidence starts coming in that they mightn't be achieving what they set out to achieve? So firstly, what is broadband? Well, if you go to virtually any official definition, it will tell you it's some variant of that top line. I'm going to contend today that that's rubbish. That's not a definition of broadband. It's an engineering artefact that speaks more to technological factors than it does to meaningful economic policy factors. I'm going to suggest that that's actually a measurement proxy. It's just telling us about one of the characteristics of this stuff, rather than being an object of interest in its own right. There's a risk when we set our definition of what broadband is, it's something like that we overemphasise the networks and the technologies rather than the other things that might matter. And I'm going to question why it has, of all possible measurement proxies, become the de facto object of interest. Instead, I want to put up what I think is a much more policy-relevant definition of broadband. Broadband is simply a digital data transport mechanism. It's the trucks that carry the packets. Broadband, as it's currently held in that technological network-oriented definition, is the current frontier of an internet-related general-purpose technology. If we think about this in a dynamic technological context, we started with dial-up internet access, we then went to 256k broadband access, we've then got faster and faster and faster broadband access, so that now the nirvana of broadband technology is now seen to be fibre to the home and going as fast as your gigabyte networks. Each time we go through one of these processes, we're not actually changing the thing we're looking at, we're just making a transition, just as we would when we've gone through various different production technologies in any industry. We're moving from a transition from the legacy to the frontier. So I'm going to treat the internet as the issue of interest here. Broadband is just one of the measurements of one of the artefacts associated with it. The issue that we've got now is if we're looking at a digital data transformation mechanism, the underlying further object of interest we have here is digital data, because that's what we're moving. And what we have to also think about in this broadband world is that it's also happening in the context of the convergence of many different media onto a common digital platform. But that's happening at the same time as we're having a proliferation of the number of network technologies that are capable of transporting that data. So we've got fixed and mobile, copper, cable, optical fibre, cellular, wireless, satellite, all of those sorts of things. So we've got convergence to digital, divergence of the network technologies, and many different forms via which that data can be transported. So that's what broadband is. It's not just a measurement factor. And the frontier, in that sense, will continue to be pushed out further. Gigabyte networks are not the end. But we also now have to think, as we would with any classic vintage technology model, what is the optimal point to make the transition in a policy sense, or the thinking about in a policy sense, why it matters which of these networks people are using to get their data over. I'd also like to note, before we go any further, that broadband is not fixed line voice telephony Mark II. The context is very different. When fixed line voice telephony was an object of policy interest back in the early 1990s, there was a single network, fixed, that carried voice. Mobile was still a twinkle in most people's eyes, and there really was extant market power. Broadband is different. It is diffusing into a contestable marketplace. It might not be perfect competition as the models portray it, but it is at least a contestable marketplace. We have multiple network technologies, and at the margins there is a reasonable amount of substitutability now in the way people access their data for various applications. We have a much more volatile application base. With fixed line voice telephony we had one application. It was people talking to each other over distance. Now we've got a huge array of applications, all of which are capable of being mediated in the digital world. We've got extreme variations in user preferences for which applications they want to use, and the application range is vast. The extent to which individuals use each of these applications also varies hugely. So it's a very much different world to what we had with fixed line voice telephony. And applications are not tied to specific networks anymore. The same application can now be delivered almost ubiquitously over any range of technologies. So it's not fixed line voice telephony Mark II. I will contend that this actually limits the relevance of some of our historic learnings on these policies. So what's the broadband problem? Well, whose problem is it? And what's the objective? Well, I'm an economist. Those are a whole number of things that people have alleged policymakers care about when it comes to the reasons why they might have implemented broadband policy. I'll just deal with the ones around economic aspirations, but I'm sure that other people can probably come up with a whole bunch of other reasons around all of those others to explain who cares and why they do things. But the important thing is, what is the objective? As an economist, the reason why we're interested in this for policy reasons is that somehow this stuff must actually be related to economic growth. So how does broadband contribute to economic growth? Well, it's surprising that there's actually very little in the literature that actually addresses this. My take on this is that the demand for the internet is derived, it's a derived demand from the value that end users accrue from using the applications on the internet. So it really is highly contingent on demand side factors. And until we start getting a better understanding of exactly how users derive economic benefit from the applications, it's going to be very difficult to make good policy on the supply side. Connections to the internet simply enable the potential for end users to derive benefits. A connection in itself does not confer a benefit. It only offers the potential to get the benefit from the applications. It's necessary but not sufficient for economic benefits to accrue. Applications are what is the mandatory factor for generating those economic gains. As I said, interactive conversations were the single application that rendered voice telephony useful. Internet is different. And the network effects, where there are some network effects, arguably there may be some in terms of an economy of scale on the supply side for particular network structures, but when it comes to the network effects in the digital world, because the network effects attached to the application, they're not the classic network effects that we normally think about when we're trying to just get enough users on a network to justify the fixed costs of building it. It's a very different way to think about it, and we've got to think about the interaction of those two factors. So what does this do? Well, access to the internet enables benefits to be accrued from faster broadband that were not possible on slower networks. If new applications are able to be used that weren't available on dial-up, then there will be the benefits released from those new applications. But if the application base stays constant, then all that broadband does is it offers the marginal benefit of using the same application on a slightly different network. Now that could be because it takes less time to download stuff on a faster fixed line connection, but it's not the whole benefit that accrues from using that application, it's only the marginal benefit of being able to do it a little bit faster. Video on demand is, even if we did it looking, even if we consider that, the relevant benefit that is generated is not the total value from consuming a movie delivered over the internet. It's only the marginal benefit that accrues from consuming that movie relative to the next best alternative way of getting it, i.e. buying the DVD or going down to the library and hiring it, or watching it over broadcast television. It's not the whole benefit, it's only the marginal benefit. And we do have to remember that users are consuming these new goods still within their constrained budgets. So when they buy something, they have to compare that with the relative benefit of what they're already consuming. So does getting my digital copy of a book from Amazon any faster over the internet give me substantially greater benefit than if I got that book from just a digital copy from the library? Well, it all depends. If I never wanted to read the book in the first place, it doesn't do much for me at all. But if I did want to read that book, it's really just that marginal benefit of getting it in real time, as opposed to maybe waiting for 24 hours for having the disc couriered to me. How much is that extra benefit worth for me? Those are the sort of questions that underpin the demand side. And now again, when we're thinking about ultra-fast broadband with optical fibre to the premises, what's the additional benefit of pushing that out in relative terms? Well, it comes back in the end to what applications it facilitates largely, or what new applications could only be offered on that network relative to those that are quite capable of being run on existing networks, but possibly with a slightly slower transport time. so as transport cost. I mean, this is the classic comparison between whether people actually have to have something on the hour turnaround courier, or whether they're prepared to wait 24 hours to get it, and how much that extra benefit is worth, and what's the trade-off for the cost. A cautionary tale in broadband policy. Is there an indisputable causal relationship between broadband, however it's measured, and economic growth? Well, if you read the literature, you would think I was a bit ridiculous for asking this question. But it is actually interesting when one looks back now at papers that cite this unconditional, unilateral, one-dimensional benefit that attends there. There probably is some benefit, because if there wasn't, we wouldn't see people actually moving to getting faster and faster broadband connections. But when we put it in the context that we are seeing not quite as many people purchasing faster connections as we thought, we do have to now start questioning this unilateral measurement here between more of the infrastructure and more of the economic growth, without looking at the mediating applications in between. And as a word of warning to policymakers who are looking at the current literature, I pulled the Roller and Waverman is the most cited paper when it comes to the unconditional effect of telecommunications infrastructure on economic growth. There were 121 citations on ideas when I looked yesterday. I pulled down the 10 at random from that, and found that 8 out of 10 of those stated that Roller and Waverman said that broadband or ICTs are linked with a causal relationship with economic growth, not telecommunications. One of them said that broadband drives economic growth because Roller and Waverman said, and one of them cited the paper but didn't even use it in the text. What I'm suggesting here is that we have to be very careful that, in fact, people who are writing these papers have actually read their evidence and understand the data they've actually put in there, because Roller and Waverman do not say anything about broadband and have very little that they can possibly say about the internet or ICTs at all, because what they investigated was the link between telecommunications investment and economic growth. Their data comes from 1970 to 1990. So it predates almost all of the internet. The last couple of years might have actually pulled in a little bit of commercial internet, but not much. But it has absolutely nothing to say about what broadband gives us. So I think we have to be very careful that this assumption that because one person in the Chinese whispers chain a few years ago might have said something about Roller and Waverman and everyone else has subsequently cited it, it doesn't mean that there is actually an absolutely unequivocal causal relationship between broadband and economic growth. And I think that's something, a research agenda that I'm doing work on at the moment, and I know Scott is as well, and I'm hoping a few more people do, because when one looks at that application base, it's very much more complex. There are some papers that are starting to come out with some data, but as I said in Howell and Grimes 2010, it is neither simple nor unidirectional, and most of the papers so far that have actually investigated this have come up with the finding that if there is an effect, it's very much smaller than it was originally indicated in the hype. So be very careful what you're looking at when you're actually looking at what your objective of interest is, what your objective function is, and does the data that you're pulling up actually relate to your objective interest, or is it actually irrelevant to that story? I would argue that a court presented with Roller and Waverman would say that that's totally inadmissible when it comes to the link between broadband and economic growth, and it would have been kicked for touch from day one. How do we measure it? Well, this is the broadband per capita problem. Broadband uptake per capita has become the de facto measurement that in virtually every policy paper I've examined has seemed to be the single thing that is measured with interest. Again, like the 256k, it is simply one measurement artefact. It doesn't tell us a great deal at all, but it's become part of the modus operandi in policy, where it's become like the Roller and Waverman case. More broadband is unconditionally better than less broadband. Faster broadband is unconditionally better than slower broadband, and having it sooner is unconditionally better than having it later. Why? Well, The policy implication of that is that we now actually have this broadband competitiveness has become an international Olympic sport where every country wants to be the winner. This is making an assumption here that there's some sort of winner-takes-all race here, that somehow racing to the top of the OECD league tables confers a benefit, that if you get there first, nobody else has got it. And it seems to be forcing, particularly not just in the area of who's got more people connected, but also in the issue of who's got the fastest network, that there is some sort of winner-take-all race here. I would contend instead that it's not a winner-takes-all race when it comes to broadband, because there's benefits of waiting, which I'll come to later. The problem we've now got, though, in the policy context is that broadband policy internationally has turned into this, what I've called keeping up with the Joneses, Kims and Watanabes, that in order to move one or two spaces further up the broadband rankings, countries are investing large amounts of money finding out or to be a little bit further up the numbers. They're also, in the New Zealand case at least, hardwiring these OECD targets into their strategies to the point where I would argue that the metric by which we measure this stuff has in many cases become an objective in its own right. And it's not exactly clear why we should want to have that, because the consequence of having done that is, unless we think about this carefully in relation to the applications, that if all we're doing is pursuing policy and convergence with everyone else, all the lemmings will go off together. And if it's not, it's easily seen that the lead lemming is saying to the second, you can be leader when we get to the bottom. If it's not a winner-take-all race, I just want to pose the question, why do we treat our broadband policy competition as though it is? But even if broadband uptake per capita is a relevant metric, is there some worth in actually pursuing something around that in relation to our economic objective? I'm not wanting to dismiss it as being irrelevant to the question, merely how much weight we put on it. And when we're thinking about the question, what is important about this as a way of modelling the way we think about these metrics for ongoing policy development. If the economic objective is our overriding concern in our policy exercise, the question we should be asking is, I contend, what is the correct or most efficient rate of broadband deployment, uptake and utilisation in a given economy, currently and over the life cycle of the technology? Now, at least there we've got three different metrics, deployment, uptake and utilisation. So that gives us a much richer story than just measuring the deployment one. And it also links through, if you can see in the paper when we now think through to the applications, it links through to how we can see the link between applications driving the purchase of broadband, which then leads to the growth of the economy. And as a cautionary tale again, the merits of multiple metrics. Korea has very high levels of broadband uptake per capita historically. It's been the gold standard to which many countries have aspired over time. But when one steps back and just adds in two more metrics into the equation, now these metrics apply more to the utilisation measures that we're now thinking about, what are people actually using the internet for. These also are metrics that are available from the OECD data, secure service per capita, domain names per capita, as relevant measures of the economic uses to which internet connectivity is being put. Korea has been very high in the OECD in uptake per capita, but it's never been out of the lower quartile of the OECD since I started looking at this in 2000 in secure service and domain names per capita. On the other hand, the United States and New Zealand, while the mid-rankers in broadband uptake per capita, have never been out of the top third of the OECD in those two things, because in both countries there's actually quite a lot of evidence that there's extensive commercial use of the infrastructure, which if we think about it in terms of that economic imperative, it's leading to meaningful, measurable economic characteristics that would actually be what we're trying to achieve in this world. If, in fact, it's the economic uptake that's our overriding imperative, not the broadband uptake numbers. In that same light, Japan has the widest diffusion of fibre broadband in the OECD. 63% of broadband connections in Japan are fibre. But fast fibre doesn't seem to be having anything to do with the number of people actually buying broadband, because in the last lot of OECD statistics, Japan was only 16th in the OECD, sitting between the USA and New Zealand in broadband uptake per capita. So there doesn't appear, even on those very rough descriptive statistics, seem to be necessarily those correlations that feed back into those questions that more broadband is better broadband, faster broadband is better broadband, or having broadband first or earlier before anyone else is actually unequivocally better than having it later than somebody else. Because that more balanced perspective with multiple metrics leads us to believe that some of these less well-performing countries may well have actually been deriving the economic gold because their portfolios and the way their policies have played out over time have led to a more balanced array of policies, not focusing on one in particular. I haven't done anything in particular to look at how that might play out over the OECD generally, but I suspect that that's partly to do with the fact that New Zealand was the last of the OECD countries to pursue industry-specific regulation. And up till about 2006 or 2004-ish, it was following pretty much the same sort of policies as the United States in that area, where there weren't picking winners, there wasn't incentivising of particular technologies, and that has perhaps led to a more balanced deployment of the use of the other things that drive economic growth, rather than putting all of the policy effort into just driving one statistic. So, does the evidence confirm the existence of a genuine broadband uptake problem? Well, to get to this question, I think we have to ask, well, why do we use broadband uptake per capita? And we use it because we used to use something like it once upon a time, because we used to measure telephone, voice telephony lines per capita, and we always measured it, so of course it's there and we use it. It used to tell us something once. We used it for telecoms when we're looking at particularly the liberalisation agenda of the 80s and 90s to tell us whether we're actually succeeding with our liberalisation agendas. But broadband is different. Does an uptake statistic tell us the same thing now, in the early stage of a new technology's rollout, as we were told in the late stage of the voice telephony market? In order to do that, we need to think about what a diffusion curve looks like. Diffusion curves play out here across time with the classic S-curve. When we introduced liberalisation in the voice telephony world, we were at the top end of this diffusion curve. Most households had voice telephony connections. It's a mature world. We've got established patterns of competitive interaction between the players, and if there was an impediment there, for example, having a monopoly, then if you did something to affect one characteristic, i.e. the price, through a little bit of competitive pressure by adding 2 or 3 new entrants, then a stable movement up at that point would have been a good indicator that your market liberalisation policy was delivering you some economic benefits. At the very beginning, though, when a technology rolls out, we have a very different environment whatsoever. And it's not just in terms of the demand side with consumers, but also in the supply side. When a new technology comes out, it's new, it's risky. It's often unproven because no consumers have bought it yet, so you don't really know how they're going to value it. Because of those risks and high costs, we tend to only have a very small number of firms providing it, and it's at very high cost. The only people who will buy it initially are the very early adopters, for whom the benefit of the applications they can use on it are overwhelmingly positive, despite the fact that they pay high prices. So high prices and low uptake in the early stage of a technology is exactly what we expect. Also, what we expect to see here is not a lot of competition. 1 or 2 firms may be having a play with it. If it's really costly with a lot of fixed and sunk costs, we may only have 1. But that's not necessarily a problem. If, on the other hand, though, when we put it out there are huge benefits, because unequivocally the applications that are available do generate real benefits to users, then even if we didn't have competitive entry, we will see consumers buying it simply because the benefits they derive from the applications exceed even high costs of business. So we see them adopting. But importantly, they adopt, if we hold the price constant, they adopt in declining application value. So if we keep the price constant, the ones that are the latest adopters here are the ones that have the very least value from the applications. So the more people we adopt, the lower the marginal additional benefit of the next adopter is. So when we're at this end here, trying to get a few more people buying the connection, we're trying to get the most recalcitrant, lazy adopters of the last adopters to get onto the technology. That's a very different proposition to motivating the early adopters with high valuation at the beginning. If we now throw in the ability to competition play out in this, then if we hold the applications constant, then more competition reduces the price, meaning with the constant application base we see more consumers adopting, simply because as the price comes down, the more marginal adopter with a constant application base can now adopt, moving up to that point. And then when we keep price and users constant and we just throw in more applications, even if we hold the price constant, more applications mean more users get to do more things, so the current users get to use more stuff on the internet, so they get more benefit from the capacity they've already bought. So that is where we would also see, instead of measuring this as connections over time, we measure it as the amount of usage over time. We'll see that follow that same pattern as well. So all three of those things can play out. In the normal competitive process in an infrastructure, limited number of players at the beginning, increasing competition as new varieties come to market, as the technology gets more proven, the risks reduce to suppliers, the information goes out, more consumers learn things, more applications become available. But as we move into the more mature phase, we see the rationalisation of the number of providers. That actually it now gets a much more stable market, the patterns of interaction are the same, we've got no new applications coming along, we've eked out most of what we can out of new technology, or changing the production technologies have been eked out. So we end up getting to the saturation point again, and we're in the mature market. And how do we stay there? Well, we break out of it by going yet again to the next variant on our progression through the technologies. So we get to there with, for example, dial-up, and we go back to the beginning with standard broadband. We get there with standard broadband, we go back to the beginning again with ultra-fast broadband. But all of those competitive pressures play out differently over the life of the infrastructure, and we need to be aware of that. So, just said all of that. So, broadband uptake in that case is a complex web of interacting factors that take care of all of those things, and that's why it's so difficult, on the one hand, to be able to interpret much of the evidence we see, but why it's so fascinating for us as researchers to start looking at this stuff. So now, given that I'm running out of time, I'll start going through some of our war stories of how we've seen some of this stuff play out in practice. Everyone is very interested in the fact that some statistics econometrics researchers are quite keen when we're looking at these models to see a statistically significant link to the object of interest that we're looking for. So if this is broadband uptake per capita and some metric like, let's say, local loop unbundling, or any of the other things like population density or national income or whatever, we need to be clear not just about the fact that there's a statistically significant link, but how material is that link. If in fact you see that in the case of local loop unbundling in New Zealand in the Derrida model that is talked about extensively in my response to the Berkman paper in 2009, if we look at what that was in that particular model, it came out with a statistically significant factor, but that's great. The policy has driven a model, it's come up with a statistically significant conclusion. We'll leave to one side the econometrics. Is that actually worth doing? Well, the coefficient on that statistically significant factor, when one looks at the size of the effect it would have had, is so small that you'd have to wonder why we've spent all of that time worrying about local loop unbundling driving broadband uptake. What we saw when we applied that to New Zealand in 2007 is it would have led to a princely extra 20,000 connections out of a total of 700,000. When these models are driven, remember that the models have very many variables playing out for them, all of those factors there. If one looks at the Derrida model, one sees that it has many of those things in it, yet all of the use of that model has been honing in on one particular variable in that model, largely because that was what Derrida emphasised in his write-up, the LLU one. If you look at that model, you'll find that the dummy variable, doing nothing, had 9 times the effect on broadband uptake in New Zealand in that time than invoking the policy. It was also statistically significant. In fact, it was more statistically significant than local loop unbundling. That particular model tells you about many different policies. So be aware when you're looking at that you're informing more than one particular question. Sometimes if we ignore the materiality in trying to find a statistically significant result, we've potentially fallen victim to the availability bias. We've got all that software in the world, we've got all of those numbers, and we'll just do whatever we can and throw it through as many models as possible to try and find something that actually comes up with statistical significance, but we lose sight of the big objective that we're actually trying to achieve. If what we really were trying to achieve was accelerating broadband uptake per capita, this model tells you doing nothing is far more successful than intervening. So you have to question whether it's worth the expense. So, what policies have been proposed to ameliorate the broadband problem? 1. Access regulation comes up time and again. I want to question what objective is access regulation actually addressing? Access regulation was introduced in the 1996 Act in the United States to deal with a competition problem. How do we manage to make part of the market more competitive? That is the objective. If we go back to our model here, in the early stage of a new technology, i.e. broadband, how important is competition? It's actually much less important at the early stages of a technology rollout than it is in the mature stages of an old technology. So if competition is the objective, then is that even relevant for thinking about that particular tool in the context of driving broadband uptake per capita? Well, it is important because, in fact, if you think about the policy-making process, we have a sunk cost problem. For those jurisdictions that have implemented it, if they are actually looking at whether this is actually helping or harming in the new world, then of course they do have an incentive to try and find out whether this is actually helping or harming the uptake of the new technology. So I would argue that for a country that has already implemented the policy, that might be relevant, but that's a different question to that being asked in a country like the United States or like New Zealand in 2006 that hasn't implemented it. So it does affect the admissibility of the evidence of papers done in jurisdictions where they're looking to answer a slightly different question. The model is useful, and by all means look at what the model tells you, but the important stuff for the policy exercise is not the write-up that the academics or the analysts put around the story because they're answering a different question. Look at the model and see how the model informs the question you've got, not how their conclusions might influence you. I've got a bit of stuff there about broadband uptake per capita, but it's probably a bit irrelevant. Unfortunately, it's very easy to fall victim to the problem of driving fast with your pedal to the metal, looking because we're chasing this broadband uptake indicator and we've got to get there before the next guy. But unfortunately, if we're still worrying about looking in the rear vision mirror to sort out the 1990s problem, we might actually be going flat out in the wrong direction. And in New Zealand, I think we have very much fallen victim to that availability bias because we're not sure whether we're dealing with tomorrow's problem, broadband uptake per capita, or yesterday's problem, competition in the fixed line voice telephony market. If we're not clear about which one of those objectives the policy is addressing, then we run the risk of dealing well with neither of them. And we've seen some examples in New Zealand that probably have affected very much what is happening. Just trying to think. I'll come to that one indirectly. No, I will go back to that now, sorry. One of the problems we've had in New Zealand is I think we have been very much trying to deal with yesterday's problem, getting fixed line voice telephony competition sorted out. We've been very much fighting yesterday's war. And because of that, whenever a problem emerges, the first recourse to action is we've got a dominant player, so it must be a competition problem. So we have to now go and find a competition problem, whether there's one there or not. Unfortunately, that means we sometimes miss the wood for the trees or the elephant in the room. We have to then again look at this in relation to that whole panoply of evidence. The theory suggests that dominant firms overcharge and underinvest, but when I analysed that stuff I couldn't find evidence of either. So that suggests that it's not actually a competition problem there in the first place. There might be a dominance issue, but a dominance issue does not equal a competition problem. But if your competition problem is defined by a metric such as the number of lines sold by competitors to the entrant, then you're not actually looking at the wide range of metrics that can inform on your question. In New Zealand, of course, what happened was that we didn't have an uptake problem. We had very high levels of uptake of dial-up internet access. We had a very competitive internet access environment. We had very low prices of new technologies, very early rollout. We just had an uptake problem. So it wasn't even a supply side problem in the first place, it was a demand side problem. But the government decided, well actually there was in 2003 we had an inquiry into local loop unbundling that was done as a principled approach by the competition authority, and local loop unbundling was rejected because that was evidence such as what I presented was actually weighed against the alternatives, and on balance of probabilities the regulator came to the conclusion that unbundling was more bother than it was worth then. But they did a deal to put bitstream unbundling in as a political compromise to stop the entrants complaining to the politicians about something. That led to some problems that we'll talk about later, but you know, be very careful that what you've got is a competition problem because there's more than one way of measuring it. We went to structural separation, we just got more and more intensively regulated, and hopefully if I have to go very quickly I can tell you some more of the evidence. So the conclusion of this, coming through all those things we've been to so far, is that there is no substitute for understanding what really is going on with the industry drivers and the econometric modelling processes. Forget the conclusions, understand the industry, understand the stage of the diffusion process you're in, be clear about how the econometric modelling processes factor that in, and you can find a lot of information in those models that will inform your policy making process. But when you're looking at the models, the next step is be clear, ensure that the variable of interest in the model is the only one that could possibly be causing the problem that you're seeing. And this is one of the things that I have become a little bit famous in this part of the world with the Bronwyn Howell and Zhang model, which came up to realise that in fact the way the local loop unbundling variable was specified here was strongly correlated with something else that wasn't in the model, that led to, when we unpacked it, all of the statistical significance being applied back yet again to that factor at the time that the policy had been in place. So just because it's statistically significant doesn't mean to say that it's the everything. Understand the model, understand the dynamics that are going on in that diffusion model, and kick the tyres of these things to see if there's something in those models that doesn't quite stack up, that there's some factor that it's not accounting for that could possibly push you in a different direction. And this is where the value of someone being paid to be the perennial sceptic or the tyre kicker or always the negative sayer and thinking about these things is a good system, because as long as you've got someone whose job it is to come up with a case, any case that this mightn't actually be a good thing, you'll start getting some thinking around these sorts of ways in which the models don't actually capture everything. Because remember, models are only that, they're only models of the real world, and they'll only take us so far. Also, going back to the availability bias, we have to be very careful when we're looking at the way these models have been applied to ensure that the models are actually pulling in all the relevant data that we've got available to us. the admissibility of the precedents comes from whether they are actually testing what we're looking for, but have they also got the data that we need as well. Remember back in the early days of broadband uptake per capita, we did a lot of econometric modelling to work out which of things like GDP per capita, population density, urbanicity, age, education, and all of those things affected broadband uptake. We did used to, in those days as well, quite commonly leave Korea out of the numbers when we crunched them. Because when we crunched the numbers, Korea kept messing them up. But we knew at that point why Korea was messing the numbers up, because we knew at that point that Korea had actually paid, the government had paid large sums to build their nationwide network. So if we were looking for what explained broadband uptake in the other 29 countries out of the 30 OECD ones, then putting Korea in was actually messing it up. We took it out, we found something meaningful. Our question was subtly different. That's no excuse for some modelling I have seen where in order to make the model or the theory fit, get the data to fit the policy, we use econometric tricks to get the econometrics nicer, which end up compromising the data set that we've started with in the first place. I'll say no more about that one because I've written it up in other places and you can read it there. But we do have to be very aware of how these biases in what we're trying to do when we are the policy makers affect how we interpret the data and how we make the case. And coming back to my thesis, this is why it actually is quite helpful if we can have an independent arbiter of the evidence and its relevance to the question, making the decisions about go or not with a policy, because these are the sorts of evidence that that person might actually want to question when they're looking at how relevant the evidence produced is for the question that's being answered, or whether in fact the evidence that's being presented actually belongs in another court. So back to the New Zealand example. I'll try and be quick, but I do want to do this one. In New Zealand, the question that keeps asking is, does regulation of any sort actually help broadband uptake? Well, in New Zealand in 2003, as I said, we implemented bitstream unbundling. We didn't go to full local loop unbundling because it was deemed at that stage to likely interfere with the development of the fibre to the node network that Telecom had at that time proposed to implement. So, Q3 2004, we implemented broadband bitstream unbundling. There was a reasonable amount of evidence at the time coming out of particularly Britain that in fact this did seem to be at least correlated with higher levels of broadband uptake. But it was implemented with the specific reason of making the market more competitive. It was assumed that we had an uptake problem because Telecom was acting anti-competitively. If we introduced bitstream unbundling, we were increasing the competitive intensity in the market. That should have led to a reduction in prices, an increase in uptake, and we should have had everything wonderful in the world. And lo and behold, that's what the numbers showed. Q3 2004, we implemented bitstream unbundling, and what happened? Broadband uptake took off, didn't it? But that evidence tells us nothing about the effectiveness of the policy that we implemented. Remember, we implemented bitstream unbundling because we wanted to make the market more competitive. That was the graph effectively that was used to say that we've succeeded in driving the uptake, the policy has succeeded. In fact, when bitstream unbundling was implemented, targets were set in place where Telecom was required to have sold 250,000 broadband connections by December 2005, and to prove that bitstream unbundling was working, 33% of them had to be sold to competitors to the incumbent. That's the evidence on how successful regulation to improve competition in New Zealand actually was. We introduced bitstream unbundling here. It was announced end of Q4. It was introduced Q3. The minute the policy was announced, the market became less competitive. Telecom overshot the broadband uptake per capita figure in 2005 by 11%. So if broadband uptake per capita was our objective, whatever was going on in New Zealand was working. But by that graph, it certainly wasn't bitstream unbundling. Because in fact what has happened is the market has become less competitive as a consequence of the legislation at the same time as the uptake has taken off. Now when I put this up, I said, well, that actually tells me that actually your regulation was absolutely irrelevant. It did nothing to the market. In fact, I've got correlations that actually prove a couple of applications, namely Facebook and New Zealand's local variant of eBay called TradeMe. It was actually responsible for most of that. In fact, what had happened is that even though a policy works in one jurisdiction, you can't assume that it will automatically play out the same way in another jurisdiction if you have different underlying characteristics in the jurisdiction you put it into. That graph wasn't looked at in New Zealand because, unfortunately, the mix-up between implementing a competition policy to address a broadband uptake problem meant that the policy went in, but the uptake statistics were used for the measurement, not the competition ones, apart from a spot point of what was achieved at that time. What really happened was that when you put in a target, like Telecom had, you actually end up introducing a strategic game between the players. If everyone knows that Telecom has to sell a certain number of circuits, and so many more of them have to be sold by the entrants than the incumbent, what incentives do the competitors have to actually make it work? Because the unwritten implication is if Telecom fails to meet the targets, then the regulator will actually probably be even more stringent with the regulation and possibly go and introduce full local loop unbundling. So there's no incentive for them even in that scenario, but when you dig a little bit deeper and now start looking at the demand side metrics that sit in there, looking at things like prices and applications, as I said, applications on the demand side explained the uptake, but the second factor was that New Zealand didn't have a supply side problem in the first place. We already had low broadband prices, we had other reasons delaying uptake, but when that wasn't factored in, they introduced bitstream unbundling, but when the price was calculated, the retail price that the incumbent was selling the entry-level DSL product for was only $2 more than the bitstream unbundling price. So if there's only a small margin, why would the entrants actually want to sell the bitstream connections? Second, we didn't have a competition problem in the internet market because we had a very vibrant dial-up market which had seen competitors to the incumbent have more than 50% of market share. What we were seeing there was in fact the residual problems that arose from the interconnection agreement that played out between the incumbent and the entrant in the fixed line telephony market. Because in New Zealand dial-up internet access was unlimited and the interconnect agreement meant that in our high levels of dial-up uptake, the average internet user was actually generating a $10 interconnect revenue that went to the by way of contract, and it ended up going to the ISPs who were signed up to the rival to Telecom that had some infrastructure, meant that in fact those rivals to Telecom actually were making more profit by selling dial-up internet connections than they were from selling the bitstream unbundling connections. So not only did they have no rational incentive, they had no financial incentive either to sell the connections. So while the legislation was actually devised to make the market more competitive, the net result was the financials didn't play out because in New Zealand it was not BT, it was not Britain, we had different underlying context in the way things played out, the problem was different. So not just know what's going on in your own market, know what's going on in the market where the model's applied, because the model that worked in one doesn't necessarily work in another if the underlying characteristics are different. There is no substitute for examining your own data. You can't assume that the models themselves are transferable unless you can understand what's happening. What this example shows is monitoring matters, and monitor against the objectives you've implemented the policy for, because you can't actually keep on increasing the competition ratchet to solve an uptake problem if in fact there isn't really a competition problem affecting the uptake in the market in the first place. If you misread those signals, if you're trying to solve today's problem with yesterday's technology, if you haven't worked it out, you'll continue to get into the New Zealand situation and actually regulate in the same way that you have, that other countries have, for no great effect, because your own country is different. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there that leads to a bunch of other things that you can read about in the paper. But the conclusion that I'll come to now is that dynamic markets are highly complex. There is no substitute for understanding both the underlying industry drivers and the econometric modelling processes. There may be many ways of explaining observed phenomena. The context matters. Monopolies for policy ideas are still monopolies with all that entails. And by my experience, a contestable process in a quasi-judicial manner that allows a reasonably neutral way of evaluating the quality of the evidence, the relevance of it, the clarity of the objective, and can come to a decision that is both transparent and appealable, is far superior than the alternative, as long as the judges are sufficiently skilled to do it. So policy, the evidence and the process must all be aligned to have good evidence-based policy. Thank you.
I should have mentioned that there is a reception after this talk, and the reception is where?
Atrium.
Atrium of the law school, and Professor Howell will be there to continue the conversation. We have a few minutes for questions. Who would like to ask a question? Go ahead, please identify yourself.
I'm Frank Mann. I'm School of Public Policy. I wonder, in the early slides you showed Korea as a leader in speed and so forth, but you didn't indicate whether they had found out whether it was effective or more for show.
I do address that in the paper. Even Korean researchers are now coming to the conclusion that probably the most successful thing they did was build a national showcase to sell iPads and other things that they make in Korea. It's not at all clear that there has been any economic effect in Korea, and even Korean researchers are questioning that now.
Thank you.
Mario Schwartz, FCC. I was interested in your slide on going back a ways on the omission of Switzerland and how that altered the results of Berkman's study. Can you just elaborate on it a bit?
That one.
Yeah, I think so. So kind of walk us slowly through that one.
Right.
The Berkman study gets cited a lot, so.
The Berkman study.
So first of all, tell them what the Berkman study was from the Berkman Center at Harvard University. It was commissioned by the Federal Communications Commission.
Right, the Berkman study took the model that had been developed by Derrida and critiqued by myself and my co-authors as evidence that local loop unbundling drove broadband uptake. They addressed, I didn't fully explain VHZ because we didn't have enough time, but basically in that paper we found that there were two problems with the Derrida model. Firstly, there was an econometric problem because the econometrics used to crunch the numbers was not appropriate for the panel data that was being used, and when that was taken out it ceased to be significant. We also proposed that there was a modelling problem because the variable used, local loop unbundling, the length of time local loop unbundling had been available, was strongly correlated with the length of time broadband had been available, and when we recalculated the model, it was actually the length of time broadband had been available that was the effect that Derrida was finding. The Berkman Centre, in their material presented for the FCC, recalculated the Derrida model using econometric techniques that corrected for the first of the problems we found in Boyle, Howell and Zhang. But when they did so, they appear to have, and they state in the paper, that the effect of local loop unbundling is more significant when the data for Switzerland are left out. It's not entirely clear in their tables whether they are the data with or without Switzerland, but regardless of that, I would contend that if one knows about what the data are telling you, there were only 4 countries out of 30 in the OECD in the data panel that had not implemented local-led unbundling, of which Switzerland was one. Omitting Switzerland, which also happened to be the one that had the highest broadband uptake per capita of the 4 countries, was certainly going to leave you with a more significant effect on the basis of the model, because in fact at least 1/4 of the meaningful data had actually been left out of the analysis. Coming back to my question, my statement about when we analysed those models for Korea, if you are going to leave data out of your estimation, you have to have a jolly good reason why you would choose to do so. In a judicial process, omitting evidence is only possible on the basis of the judge deciding it's not admissible in the first place. In this case, omitting Switzerland does appear to be a bias in the evidence that would mean that it would discredit the testimony. As I said, the comparator was, in early models on broadband uptake, we used to leave out Korea, but we left out Korea because we didn't want to know what was causing broadband uptake in Korea. We were wanting to know what caused broadband uptake in the other 29 countries that hadn't funded their network. If you're going to leave data out, or if your modelers have left data out, you have to be quite clear why they've left it out, because if they've left out very valuable data, as in this case, you may end up taking their word for something that was actually inadmissible evidence in the first place.
But how much of an impact does it have if you put them back in?
Huge impact.
That's my real question.
Huge impact. Because Switzerland was actually in the top quartile of the OECD for broadband uptake per capita. And in fact, the statistical significance of the variable, even in the flawed Derrida and Berkman specifications, is much less significant when you take it out, and the coefficient is smaller. So, you know, the statement they make is they left it out because the effect was more significant when they left Switzerland out. Well, of course, when you leave out the most valuable data that could possibly disprove your case, you'll come up with something that looks less bad for your case.
Yeah, no, but I think the critique is, so I agree with that, but somebody might say, all right, so let's suppose they put it back in. If it didn't make much of a difference, then what's the big fuss about it?
No, they argued it made a big difference, and they said, well, that's the reason for taking it out. It's not clear if that's what.
No, I agree, but I think that would be helpful to emphasize.
Well, as I said, there sometimes are good modelling reasons for leaving data out, but that was not one of them. And given that that was the only econometric evidence produced in that paper, I think that leaves their case for the prosecution actually failed in that case on the fact that there was no case to answer in the end because their evidence was inadmissible.
A question here on the services, the unbundling. So generally policymakers have a little understanding of services and they like products or so on. And bundling is of course a service. So it seems that this bundling was more, isn't according to you then, that this bundling could provide more competitive service offerings than before. And then now forcing the unbundling, that you would reduce then sort of the competitiveness of the offering. And that would explain the lowering of the growth. If I saw your graph there before 1974, it's clearly an exponential growth until 2004, and afterwards actually it looks more linear. So it sort of took some of the competitiveness out of it.
In the New Zealand context, what we're talking about here with bitstream unbundling, it's not about services, it's just about a competitor being able to sell the access component. New Zealand does have some characteristics when it comes to services bundling in that we don't actually have a triple play offering in most parts of the country because the main paid television provider is a satellite provider. So what we've in fact got here, in this model here, is that there's just coincidence at the time of that uptake coincided with the timing of the regulation being implemented, meant that in fact it's less competitive. And if you were to just take that on descriptive statistics, you'd have to say in New Zealand, reducing the competitiveness of the market actually drives broadband uptake. But that's not the conclusion that data is leading to. That's actually, in the context of New Zealand, that says that the regulation had no effect. Or if it did have an effect, it wasn't the one that was anticipated when the legislation was put in place. Because if the legislation was put in place with the explicit purpose of making the market more competitive, then it's failed, because the market's less competitive. But when I put that other context in, we come to the conclusion that the regulation is actually irrelevant, and that is in fact other things that's driving that uptake. And I can actually show with an R squared of 0.99 that it was those two applications, the local eBay product, which incidentally in a country of 4.4 million, we have 2.8 million New Zealanders have accounts on Trade Me, which is Kevin the Kiwi in the notes, the little Kiwi icon that's used for that. 2.8 million New Zealanders have Trade Me accounts, and that exponential growth is most strongly correlated to the number of page views on Trade Me. So basically, in order to participate in this online marketplace, you really needed to have something better than dial-up. And as more people bought Trade Me connections to start selling their second-hand stuff, and in fact Trade Me now, so more than 50% of the goods sold on Trade Me are actually new products, because in a small country like New Zealand, if you've got something like Trade Me, why would you bother, and you're just selling one-offs, why would you bother building your own website? You might as well just use Trade Me for it. So what we see there is it's actually applications that drive that, and as I say, the two things, applications drive the uptake, and a regulation introduced to increase competition had the opposite effect. So that led me to the conclusion that regulation in that New Zealand market was totally irrelevant. So does that answer your question?
Yes, sort of.
Well, I want to also, I mean, the Berkman study was a fairly big deal. The FCC commissioned it to help in the National Broadband Plan. When the National Broadband Plan was published in March of 2010, many were surprised that there was only one citation to the Berkman Center study. And the study had purported to say that if you look around the world, the correlation, and they put causality on it, was between countries that put in the local loop unbundling and broadband penetration. So, I mean, the dependent variable is broadband per 100, broadband subs per 100, and you know, they ran these variables. If you want to read a very nice response to it, it's in the record. Bronwyn Howell really deconstructs that very nicely, shows spurious correlation in terms of the way they're deriving that. There are other data problems that she comments on, Switzerland being one of them. There's a lot more than that in terms of data problems. Korea was called a local loop unbundling country, but they didn't put regulations in until they were clearly the #1 market in the world. And they put the regulations in a non-binding fashion due to international pressure. There's no doubt about that. They called the United States a non-local loop unbundling country. That comes as a great surprise to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that threw out 3 rounds of local loop unbundling rules. And finally, we moved away from that. So there was a regulation, a deregulation period in the United States. They switched that. So there's some of these problems. I wanted to ask Scott Wallsten if you wanted to take a minute. I know that you were on the Broadband Plan Task Force. You may or may not want to comment on the Berkman Center study, but or Professor Howell's work related to that. You might want to say something.
I think the fact that it was cited only one time says something about that. Every now and then people do listen to some important critiques.
Evidence-based policy is not the null set.
Right. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, that's fine.
I think I can just come back to the point I made, that we have to be very careful in the policy-making process that we don't fall captive to the availability bias and just rely on available policies and available evidence, that's no substitute for getting our hands dirty and doing our own work ourselves to find out what's going on in our own patch, in our own context.
Well, okay, but it's more than that. It's evaluating in the ways that you've suggested. And I have to admit, when I read the part of the record, and I saw this economist from New Zealand taking the time to submit comments into the U.S. proceedings that had to do with how we're figuring out the broadband world, I was pretty impressed. I wasn't impressed enough to take the time to look at what's happening in New Zealand and submit my comments around to that part of the world. But it was a very interesting piece of dedicated policy input. So I think we all can get a flavor for some of the contributions that Bronwyn is making. And we will make some more contributions in the atrium with Professor Howell. And I do want to thank Gordon Tullock, whose generous contribution to the law school makes the Tullock Lectures possible and allows us to bring in thinkers such as Professor Howell. And I want to thank Sarah O. and Brent Skorup, who worked with the Information Economy Project and helped to bring Professor Howell here. So please join me in thanking our speaker today.
And just to follow that up, if there is anyone here who would really like to come and compete with me in analysing the New Zealand environment, we all know that competition drives better outcomes, and I welcome that. Thank you.
And yes, the papers, the talk, I think the slides, she'll allow them, but the talk, the paper that goes with the talk, will, if not already, will be posted on our website.